You may recall a few months back, literally the day after April Fool's Day, Joshua Strobel of the Budgie Project decided to ruffle some feathers. Fedora 42 change proposal. Fedora Plasma Workstation. Now, the idea here was to take Fedora Workstation, the main flagship desktop Fedora experience that is running GNOME, and then replace that with what is currently being called Fedora KDE, making the KDE spin of Fedora the flagship Fedora experience. Now, say what you will about the GNOME UI, the GNOME UX, and all of this sort of stuff, there is one thing you absolutely cannot deny. Plasma provides a more traditional user experience that can be viewed as being more approachable to everyday computing users, serving as a smoother on-ramp to using Linux-based operating systems. Alongside its wide breadth of personalization capabilities, it provides an out-of-box experience that is more predictable than some of its counterparts, along with providing a lot more comprehensive support of Wayland protocol extensions. Now, personally, I was supportive of the idea, or maybe interested is a better term. I was really curious to see what reaction this was going to get, and it got quite a bit of reaction. A lot of it was very good debate. Some of it it was just people arguing for the sake of arguing. But realistically speaking, this was just never going to happen. KDE's release cycle is just not as clean as GNOME's. There is a reason why KDE is specifically talking about cleaning up their release cycle, because GNOME having this 6-month cycle makes it very, very easy for a point release distro to actually go and package it. Fedora developers on Workstation are primarily GNOME users because that's what Fedora has been using this entire time, so even though KDE has plenty of users, they have plenty of maintainers, the core workstation, that's just GNOME. And also, it will disrupt the current users. There is a lot of people in Fedora right now who are perfectly happy using GNOME, and uplifting their entire desktop that's not a good idea. But there is a way you can approach this idea in a way that leaves current workflows intact, but also gives a lot more power to Fedora KDE. Unbeknownst to me, 2 months ago, Neil Gompa opened this ticket: request to upgrade Fedora KDE desktop spin to edition status under the personal systems WG. What that means is taking Fedora KDE, and instead of having it be just a regular spin like Budgie or LXQt or Sway or any of the other spins, having it be at the same level as Fedora Workstation, a flagship Fedora experience. As discussed at Flock, this is the Fedora conference, the Fedora KDE SIG, and the newly forming Fedora Personal Systems Working Group that will oversee the SIG are requesting the Fedora KDE Plasma desktop spin be upgraded to edition status for Fedora Linux 42, so that'll be the next release of Fedora. This list includes the following: listing the Fedora KDE Plasma Desktop Edition at the same level as Fedora Workstation Edition on fedoraproject.org. Right now, on the Fedora website, there are two main ways we can get Fedora. We can either click on this button here, or go up to Get Fedora here. So if we click on this, or if we just scroll down, we'll see Fedora Workstation. This is the GNOME Desktop Edition, Fedora Server, Fedora IoT, Fedora Cloud, and Fedora CoreOS. Now, because the KDE version is a spin and not an edition, you will not see KDE anywhere on the homepage. To even know that KDE exists, you got to go down here, click on Learn More, and then right here, now we can see Fedora KDE. Your other option is up where it says Get Fedora. If we hover over that, we start on the edition. So once again, Workstation, Server, CoreOS, IoT, and Cloud. If you want to know about the KDE spin, you're going to go down to Spins, and then we can get it right here. So by becoming an edition, Fedora KDE would be listed in this list right here, which is kind of perfect because it has a empty slot right here, and also right here, Fedora KDE would also be listed. This isn't the only places it would need to be, but these are certainly the main ones. Production of a flagship site page for Fedora KDE, similar to Fedora Workstation on fedoraproject.org. Okay, here we have the Workstation page, and here we have Fedora KDE. They're basically the same idea of a page, It's just slightly different layouts and slightly different branding. If you ask me, neither of them are really great pages for showing off what the things can do, but this is the way they do it for the editions. And marketing support in a similar vein to Workstation at events. So presumably at places like Flock and various other places that Fedora might show up, they are gonna show off, hey look, we have Workstation. So if they're doing that, if they hand out flyers and things like that, they also need to mention equally, hey, we have Fedora KDE, our other flagship desktop. The Fedora KDE SIG will withdraw its change for Fedora Linux 42 to replace GNOME with KDE Plasma on Workstation with the acceptance of this request. Now, here's one thing I haven't seen properly discussed, at least publicly. How you're gonna name this thing, right? Because if you call it Workstation, so you have Fedora Workstation, and then Fedora KDE just gets promoted with the same name, that's not going to be like an equal status there, because you have the Workstation and then KDE. And if you're a new Linux user, what's a KDE? I don't know what that is. I want the Workstation. So implicitly by that name, it's not being given equal treatment. So do you use the Workstation name for both of them and call it Fedora Workstation GNOME and Fedora Workstation KDE? Do you drop the Workstation name entirely, call it Fedora GNOME and Fedora KDE? I haven't seen any sort of proper consensus on how this should be done. Now, when something like this happens, I usually assume there's going to be a bunch of dumb arguments, being like, oh, well, it doesn't deserve to be an edition, why should it be like this? At least publicly, maybe this happened at Flock, maybe this happened on IRC or a Matrix channel somewhere, but in the vote itself, this passed unanimously. However, it didn't pass without some very important caveats. One of them is from Matthew Miller here, the Fedora project lead. And I think they're completely reasonable caveats. Firstly, if it is turned into an edition, the quality standards of Fedora KDE shouldn't be that of just a spin, and Fedora KDE is one of the better maintained spins, but if it's going to be a flagship Fedora product, it needs to be flagship Fedora level. It needs to have those same quality assurances that are applied to Fedora Workstation or Fedora IoT or any of the other things that they offer. It needs to be a flagship product. With that being said, he is aware of how much work has gone into Fedora KDE, and he does feel like the team is capable of doing so. The second caveat is related to the hard problem of making this an edition. Turning it into an edition, that's easy. That's just a vote, that's just some forum posts, and nothing really that difficult. The difficult part is actually going and updating everything in the project to show that it is an edition. Updating your site layout, changing pages around, adding in new pages. When you go to events, making sure you actually have the material on both the Workstation and whatever Fedora KDE ends up being called. Make sure that you actually have people there that are able to talk about both versions of the project. These are the actual hard things. The quality assurance part, like, the Fedora KDE SIG has already mostly done that anyway. This wouldn't have even been considered if Fedora KDE wasn't being as well maintained as it already was. Part 1 is pretty much already done. It's just some extra quality assurances and making sure it is at Workstation level. The second one's a lot harder. And if either of these couldn't be met, it should be delayed for another version up until Fedora 43. There's no reason to do this early. Fedora KDE's been fine all of this time just being a spin. If it is going to become an edition, it needs to be done correctly. Now, due to this thread not being made for the main discussion, another thread was made over here on Fedora Discussion. There was some concern with the final sentence of the ticket. Once again, that was this. The Fedora KDE SIG will withdraw its changed Fedora Linux 42 to replace GNOME with KDE Plasma on Workstation with the acceptance of this request. It might have been better to say that as a result of the discussion and feedback that was generated by the original change proposal, requesting Fedora KDE be promoted to an edition felt like a good next step and withdraw it. as was also suggested because the change proposal doesn't guarantee any change to Fedora until it has gone through the entire process and been approved by FESCO, and this proposal is still at the announce stage. Overall, I don't see an issue with this request to grant edition status for Fedora KDE if it meets the edition requirement. Basically, the issue was around the wording rather than the proposal itself, which I'm very happy isn't something people got bogged down with. The actual reason the earlier one wasn't taken down is the people in support of that proposal didn't want to go and do so until this new solution was in place. Which, very importantly, in that original proposal, the one made by Joshua Strobel, Neil Gomper wasn't directly involved with it. This is other people who were interested in making this change. Now let's go back to the issue of testing with the perspective of a member of the quality team. Now the comment here is quite long, and frankly, I don't want to read the entire thing because a lot of it is just saying the same thing over and over again, just using different examples, but the idea here is that Fedora has things that it blocks on for a release. So that thing needs to be working for a new release to be made. This is a sensible thing to do if you ship GNOME, for example, and GNOME has some massive bug that causes a crash every time someone, I don't know, opens a web browser. You can't ship a new version of Fedora with that bug being present, so you have to wait until the bug is fixed or roll back to an older version. Now, when you only have a couple of things you block on, this isn't that big of a deal, but Fedora is really good at adding more and more and more things they want to ensure are at a certain level of quality, but don't really remove things from the list. So the list of blocking software only gets bigger and bigger, adding more and more work onto the quality team. And albeit a slightly misguided concern, one of the concerns with making KDE a main edition of Fedora is, by default, KDE is crammed with applications. There is a lot more applications in KDE than there are in GNOME. This is true by default, but in Fedora KDE, a lot of that stuff gets stripped out because a lot of that stuff is just not things that regular people are going to use. A great example of this is no one really cares about Falcon, do they? Like, tell me the last time you've ever used Falcon. It's also not entirely fair because in KDE, they tend to, I guess, modularize things a lot more than GNOME. Also, it's not entirely fair because GNOME has a lot of moving components as well, but they tend to make these more monolithic blocks, whereas KDE tends to modularize things, which makes it seem like there's a lot more things, but overall, there's still about as much to test. But the main issue is related to the Fedora Edition's promotion policy. This included a very inconvenient line. What makes an edition addresses a sufficiently distinct, relevant, and broad use case or user base that a Fedora edition is not currently serving. Now you might say, oh, KDE has a different user base than GNOME does, and that's fair, but they both serve the function of a desktop distribution. The other 2 points aren't that big of a deal. Is a long-term investment for the Fedora project? Fair enough, KDE's been around for a long time already, so turning it into an edition, it's not going to go anywhere in the first place. Is consistent with all of Fedora's 4 foundations. Again, not at all an issue. And everything else here is already being met by Fedora KDE. As I mentioned, it is one of the better maintained spins that has one of the larger teams. It basically operated like an edition, even though it was still a spin. It was kind of the flagship spin. And this also went to a vote. Basically, they wanted to make an exception to the distinct rule when we determined that doing so best fits the project's mission and vision. And again, this one passed without any concern whatsoever, with a completely unanimous vote. You might think this is crazy. There is no possible way that Fedora KDE is becoming a main flagship version of Fedora. Not the only one, granted, but is being treated with the same respect as Fedora Workstation. But to steal a line from the Dragon Age reviews, this is a return to form. The idea of KDE not being a flagship edition, this is a relatively new concept. back in the days of Red Hat Linux, the predecessor to both Fedora and RHEL, KDE was being shipped alongside GNOME. Like, you had both of those options, and up until RHEL 7, you also had this option as well on RHEL. So this is something that has already been done before in the Red Hat ecosystem. It's kind of just going back to what was already being done. It never happened on Fedora, but it's basically bringing back this tradition. So let me know your thoughts down below. Are you a Fedora KDE user? Are you a Fedora Workstation user? Or however these things are gonna be named? And do you think this is a good change? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Libera Pay, link in the description down below. That's gonna be it for me, and pick your desktop wisely.
Like this.